It is mutual aid and solidarity. It is offering support and talking to people. It is blockades of roadways, bridges, and rivers. It is chaining yourself to machinery that will drag out the pipeline or pour pavement over delicate soil or cut down the ancient trees that are essential to mitigating climate change. It is frontline communities in the Amazon rainforest. It is even the orangutan clinging to the last tree standing in its habitat. Direct action is regaining strength and is widespread. The time for collective action is now. We are in a planetary climate emergency. And I'm very excited to introduce these folks because they are working very hard to protect the habitat near my home. And so with that, I will turn it over to them.
Thank you so much. Are people able to hear and to see me? I switched to gallery view, so now I think I can be seen. Okay. Thank you so much for inviting us here to speak. Thank you, Steph, and the Speak for Wolves. We have been really honored to be asked to be here, and yesterday I was able to hear a few of the presentations and are just really excited to be in the presence of so many people who are committed to conservation, people who love wolves and who love the forests and animals. So we're really glad to be here. I just wanted to say that we are here to just have a kind of a conversation, a discussion. We're really humbled to be amongst so many people who have a really high level of knowledge about so many things. And we just want to share a bit about forest defense and what that is looking like in the contemporary culture or contemporary historical context. And we want to talk a lot about forest defense and solidarity with movements that are both national and international, seeing a lot of the connections that are happening between climate change and environmental justice and social justice and many other issues. So we're going to be talking about how forest defense and nonviolent direct action can have a place in this conversation about wolf conservation. Before we go any farther, I'm going to turn it over to my partner, Vetch, to do a little land acknowledgement.
Thanks. Yeah, so before we begin, we just want to acknowledge the history of colonization of the land we're on. The land where Abra and I live and the land where we do most of our organizing was the home and hunting grounds of many peoples. Malalas, Kalapuyans, Chinook and Clackamas, Chinook and Multnomah, Chinook and Wascos, Northern Paiute peoples, Sahaptin-speaking peoples, and many other nations who have cared for this land since time immemorial and remain today. As an organization of mostly white people in the settler colonial lineage, we are both a part of the legacy of genocide and displacement which created our public lands and working to take responsibility for that legacy. We acknowledge the lasting effects of policies of genocide, relocation, and assimilation on Indigenous people today. As forest defenders, we strive to stand with their ongoing struggles and base our actions in an anti-colonial framework. This is a never-finished process which takes commitment, reflection, and learning. So now I invite everyone here to take a minute to reflect on your own relationship to the land you're on and how you can bring a practice of acknowledgement into your life. So we'll just take a minute now. All right, if you'll come back now, thank you all for being a part of this important practice. And I offer gratitude, apology, and respect to all Native people here across the continent, in the past, present, and looking toward the future. Thank you. And now, Abra, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. We also just want to acknowledge that in this conversation about forest defense and our focus on climate resilience and climate justice, that we also want to bring in community resilience and to talk about some of the ways that the forest defense movement and the environmental movement and conservation movements are also connected to social justice movements here in the US as well as abroad. And so I just wanted to say that we are outraged by this system of violence here in the US that includes anti-Black racism and police brutality, and that we, even as we are mostly a white presenting individuals within our group, that we are struggling and connected to the fight against white supremacism, which perpetuates the police state, as well as the industrial prison system and poverty. And we condemn settler colonialism and the looting of indigenous land, lives, and knowledge. We recognize that we have a lot of privilege to be able to do work in the forest, which is not accessible for many people because of racism and ableism and other reasons. Furthermore, we recognize our privilege to focus specifically on forest defense and on nonviolent direct action because we are relatively safe from the generational violence of the injustice system. Yeah, we're going to kind of weave in and out through this discussion what the importance of solidarity and mutual aid, things that were mentioned in our introduction, and just to continually weave and to see those connections between what is happening on our forest lands and what is happening in Palestine, where there is a different but in some ways similar situation of people being torn from their lands and from their ancestral trees and practices. So just continuing to bring up different connections and to continually see that our work to protect the forest, to protect old growth forests, to protect wolf habitat is also tied into a need to have climate justice, particularly for people who are most affected by pollution and by sea level rise and by all of the catastrophes and diseases that are threatening because of climate change and widespread loss of biodiversity. So thank you very much for letting us take some time here at the beginning to really set a framework and a groundwork for intersectionality within the different aspects of the movement for justice. Yeah, and I'll turn it back over to Vetch.
Cool, yeah, so we thought we'd just start with a short video to introduce you to FCR, Forest for Climate Resilience, the group we organize with. But first, yeah, we'll be talking a while, but we want to encourage people to ask questions whenever you have them. We'll take some breaks to specifically have question times, but also put them in the chat whenever we want this to be a discussion, and we'll try to incorporate them. And then following us talking for a while, we should have time for discussion about bringing diversity of tactics into your own organizing, solidarity with groups along that spectrum, and yeah, just how we can all take this into our own organizing. So bear with me as I try to share my screen here. Oh, there we go. That should be it. All right, here we go.
Forest for Climate Resilience believes it is time to rebuild our interdependence with the forest. We are a grassroots direct action group that is committed to end commercial logging and to restore forest health in the Pacific Northwest.
Threats to the environment loom larger than ever as already permissive EPA regulations die and federal pressure to log, to mine, and to drill accelerate.
We are in a crisis and also a major turning point in the world. The possibility of radical progressive change is charged with urgency and potential. Now is the time to engage. Join the movement. Stop a clear-cut, block a pipeline. Protect the forest for indigenous sovereignty, for biodiversity, and for climate resilience.
All right, that was a little bit about the world we're working in and that we're about to delve deeper into. Abra, do you want to get us started?
Yes, thank you. So we're Force for Climate Resilience.
Sorry, everybody.
Sorry. So we're Force for Climate Resilience, and we formed last year in response to the crystal clear restoration timber sale here on Mount Hood National Forest. We'll go into that a little bit deeper later on. And we are people who are coming from many different walks of life, many different levels of experience. And one of the foundational things that we have been working on in a group is to really make sure that we're organizing in a way that is not replicating the oppressive structures that we're trying to fight against. And that means that there has been a lot of groundwork that is being laid, a lot of processes for communication are being laid. And now we are in the midst of a global pandemic and so much more that is going on this year. So for us as a group, there are a lot of conversations about how we can best use our resources and our skills to help with a variety of places where we can show up in this movement. Yeah, I'm sorry. I feel like I'm starting to spin my wheels just a little bit. But we are really humbled to be here and to be amongst people who we're sure know a great deal about what it means to work in the forest and to work in a direct action context. And so we're, like Vetch said, really encouraging people to chime in on this conversation with questions and comments. Yeah. So we really do have a focus in our group on climate resilience and on working to preserve old growth and mature forests in particular. I won't go too much into the details of the science on carbon sequestration. I think that we probably all know that pretty well. But we really are very grounded in that as our target and our focus area, and believe that by protecting those areas that we will be able to help to mitigate the worst effects of climate change. Climate resilience is a really important concept to us because we want to think about things in positive terms, in ways that we can grow and to expand. As they said in the video, working on our interconnectedness with the forest is really important to us, and having a positive vision of what human interaction can look like in that environment, and how we can really reclaim those public lands as being a space for everyone, not just for white cis men and not just for settlers, but to really investigate what access to land can look like, and in recognizing that whether it's public lands or BLM lands or anywhere on this continent, that it's indigenous land, and to recognize that the first and the best managers of this land are the indigenous people who made their home here for many centuries. So a big question for us is, how does our work interact with indigenous sovereignty? How can we really support the first people and the First Nations in being able to restore their lands and practices to a greater degree? And of course, with our work focused on climate and habitat and old growth and mature forests, that's where there's the connection with wolves. In the Crystal Clear Restoration Project, there is an active wolf pack, and in all of our work, though we don't have a specific focus on wolves, we are really mindful of the impact on wildlife and biodiversity. I'm going to pass it back over to Vetch if there's anything more that you would add in terms of who is FCR and climate and wolves.
Yeah. Well, I do want to get into kind of a bit about the history of the Crystal Clear Restoration Project, which launched us, and through that we'll get into how we came about, and also a little bit more about wolves. If I'll just get into that now. So I do want to go into it because, again, I think we have people here with a lot of knowledge, but for anyone that's less familiar with the how forest management, specifically on federal lands, happens, and how convoluted it is, this project is pretty exemplary of that. So it was first proposed in 2017 and went through a years-long process of disclosing the environmental effects of the action, and a lot of nonprofits, including BARC especially, were a part of that. But in the beginning, it was over 12,000 acres, and which included 3,000 acres of logging in mature and old growth forests, 2,000 acres of logging in spotted owl habitat. And this was an area where in 2014, the first wolves on Mount Hood were sighted in over 70 years. And then again in 2017, 2 wolves and 2 pups were sighted on camera. And this is where they wanted to do one of the biggest logging projects they've proposed in a long time. And they were billing it as a restoration project, playing on people's fears of fire and trying to say that logging would help with fire suppression, even though there was a huge and ever-growing body of evidence showing that logging, especially on the east side where this project is, causes more fire, not less. But they didn't engage with that science at all.
It's a red flower.
Sorry?
It's reference from that.
I couldn't really understand what you were saying there, but maybe if you type it in the chat.
Go ahead, Vetch.
Okay. Yeah, so there was, as they went through that process, failing to address the science. Eventually, they were sued by a number of environmental groups for failing to include that and not taking a hard enough look at the impacts. And then last June 2019, the decision came that nope, they could go ahead with the logging. They didn't have to do anything. And that's when FCR first formed. When the legal system kind of failed us, a lot of old forest defenders and new forest defenders got together and, realized we need to put energy into rekindling the area's direct action capabilities to challenge logging on the ground if logging of old growth is going to go forward, regardless of all the reasons not to. So we planned a couple camps in the area that was going to be logged over the course of last summer, where we talked about forest science, tree climbing, really just got together and talked about our visions and how we can all fit our capabilities together to make something effective. We got people from across the region together beyond this project, people from Washington and Southern Oregon, excited about bringing forest defense to all of these areas. And then I want to tell this story about the last day of camp, the last night of camp. We were wrapping everything up, having conversations, had a last campfire. It had gotten dark and we were all just hanging out around it. And then we all got silent because we heard a howl, and we all got quiet, and then we heard an answering howl. And for about 5 minutes, we all just sat in complete silence, listening to these two wolves that were probably about 5 miles away howl back and forth to each other. And for me, and I think for everyone there, that really solidified the importance of what we were doing, clarified our commitment and resolve, because it really placed us as people in the ecosystem we're trying to protect and restore, and just showed like the potential for what that relationship with the forest could be. So we left that camp restored and resolved, and over the winter did some awareness raising. Meanwhile, the restoration project was back in court for a retrial, and that lasted all winter. The decision was put off until this past April. The judge finally ruled that yes, the Forest Service was in the wrong. They need to go back and do a much more thorough environmental impact statement, which we're not sure if they have the capacity to do that. So it's kind of on pause right now, but tentatively looks like it won't be happening or will be happening on a much smaller scale. So a tentative win for that project, and now we've got groups wanting to rekindle direct action around the region, because despite that one win, the system as a whole remains unjust, undemocratic, and there's logging in other places on private, federal, state land taking place all the time that's hurting these ecosystems. Yeah, so that's the story of Crystal Clear and how we came to be. Yeah, do you want to say anything to that, Abra?
Yeah, I think you covered it really well. my personal reaction when I heard that the Crystal Clear project was being stopped in the Ninth Circuit, I just like cried and hugged my housemates and cried. And even though, as you acknowledge, there is a possibility that they will revise and try to start up this project again as some sort of zombie CCR, this definitely feels like a win and was an emotional win that I needed at the time. It was about in April when that happened, or May. Anyway, it was a really exciting that that was overturned. I want to take a little bit of time now. It's already 12:34, and just see if there are any questions that have come up in the chat.
We do have questions. Let me come back. Hi. We do have some questions. Yeah, people are interested in this. First of all, there's a comment. And again, folks, if you have questions, please type them in the chat and then we'll get them sent over. So first is a comment from Rob Ross, who says, as a Cherokee, thank you for this. I'm assuming that's in the moment of silence, I'm guessing. Next question, can you explain more about what exactly direct action looks like with examples? There were some in the in your description. And when is direct action appropriate? So two-part question there.
Yeah, those are great questions. We're going to get a little bit more into what direct action can look like and reasons why we might engage in it in this next section. So we might kind of get to that question.
Sure.
There's a follow-up one that you might cover as well. Excuse me. How can we get involved in direct action? Is it something I can do by myself? Does FCR provide trainings? And if so, what do those trainings look like?
Yeah, those are great questions as well. I think that that there are a lot of different ways that direct action can look. I think that it is usually something that is done in coordination with a group, particularly if it is like a large-scale nonviolent direct action. We'll talk a little bit about like what some roles might look like for a group to form around. But there are a lot of really small-scale things and actions that I would consider direct action that I think can be done as an individual. As far as working with FCR, we are kind of not sure how that looks right now, considering the pandemic. We had been offering trainings in the past in things as varied as climb trainings and direct action trainings, and even trainings in working to make our organizing more accessible and in interrupting active oppression. So we have offered trainings in the past, but are not at the current time because of the pandemic. You can follow us on Facebook and on Instagram or on our website to get updated on more information of things that might happen. But at this point, trainings are sort of on hold. Vetch, do you have anything you'd like to add to that, knowing that we're going to get a little bit more into the weeds of direct action in a bit?
Yeah, I guess just before we get into it, just for a general framework of what we're talking about, direct action is anything where you are directly putting your body on the line to stop something from happening in the moment. And in the forest defense movement, that's looked like tree sits to stop logging, blocking roads, or blocking machinery, things like that. the direct on the ground stuff that actually stops work in its tracks, at least for a little while. And then there's also that's the like specific definition of it, and then there's all of the other like awareness raising parts of it, but that's what the basis is. And like Abra said, hopefully in the future we'll be able to offer trainings, but because of the nature of them, it's pretty in-person work and hard to do something like that online, so we're on pause for a little bit.
I would also say that I mentioned that direct action can be kind of small scale and even spontaneous. I would expand that definition of direct action a little bit to just be like, if you see a need and you have the autonomy to make a change to address that need, and you're not going to wait for an authority to tell you that you can make that change or to take care of an issue, but you're seeing a need, you have the power to make a change, and you're interceding. So I think that that often can involve putting yourself at risk in some way. It can sometimes involve actions that do not reflect the law sometimes. But I think that it can also be like when we talk about the interconnections of mutual aid and solidarity, it can be like seeing a specific need and fulfilling it. So
positive direct action.
I want to ask quickly if there are any other questions or comments. Otherwise, I will pass it back to Vetch to talk a little bit about. I forgot, but you're on next.
Yeah, well, we can get more into why we feel this is necessary. Yeah.
Yes.
It sounds like people are very interested in you keeping going into the next section.
Okay. Yeah. So feel free to jump in wherever, Abra, but and anyone if there's specific questions about what I'm saying, but yeah, so kind of going back to the overarching system we're in, there is a rich history of activism, especially in our area, that Abra is going to go into in more detail later, that has shifted the public opinion in a lot of ways around logging. And definitely things are different now than they were 30 years ago around people's understanding of what's good for forests and opinion on how logging should be taking place. But there's a long ways to go, and the timber industry is getting better and better at greenwashing and misinformation as we go along too. And they have so much power, especially the context I know is in Oregon, so that's what I'm going to be talking to. But yeah, in the state government, in the federal government, they use people's fears of fire. They skew carbon data to say that logging is somehow good for carbon sequestration, even though like that deflates with not with just a little poke. They play to the small town image of logging, even as in the last 30 years, Wall Street investment companies have bought our private timberlands and now own most of them, and also have lobbied for essentially doing away with most taxes on forest land, treating forests in a legal way as cropland, which makes them have very little oversight and very little tax obligation to these towns, and few jobs in them. Yeah, so on private land, it's a very dire situation with very little oversight. Just a couple months ago, they passed something that was making all the lawmakers pat each other on the back was this bill to limit, to restrict how the herbicide spraying that they do after clear cutting. And the details of that were that they needed a 24-hour notification. They couldn't spray within 100 feet from streams, and they won't be able to spray within 300 feet from schools. But that's the extent of the restrictions. So that's where we're at in terms of what is able to be accomplished legally right now at the private level. On the federal lands, it's a little bit better. There's this NEPA oversight process that requires the government, any federal agency, to disclose what they're doing to the public and the effects on the environment. And they have to follow the rules in the Northwest Forest Plan. But this plan is outdated. It doesn't take climate into effect. It doesn't take into, and it doesn't into account, and doesn't take the latest science on how logging affects fire or how logging affects water retention, which are just becoming more and more important as the climate changes. Doesn't take any of that into account. So there's a certain amount that can be done, as we saw with Crystal Clear, within this framework. Like, they are beholden to the laws that are on the book, but the laws that are on the book are not very strong, and there's tons of timber industry money pushing the other way, while the situation becomes more and more urgent. So that leads us to direct action. And I want to highlight here that as we've seen protests against police brutality springing up everywhere, as many other protests throughout history have, but this is a recent example of showing how mass action, direct action, can amplify messages that people have been pushing for years, and spur action on them in a much more timely way, and bring issues into the public light. And direct action in a forest context operates in kind of the same way, bringing people power to the forest, restoring some semblance of democracy to land making decisions, because people and our voices have been cut out of this process, except in the most convoluted, not actually accessible ways. I was just part of another legal process for another timber sale that included 300 pages of legal documents you had to read through and make comments on. And that's the only way they'll take public input, is going through that process. And it's just not realistic to expect that as a basis. So we show up in the forest and make our voices heard in other ways. And Abra, if you want to talk about how that's been done.
Yes, thank you. So here where we are in so-called Oregon, as well as in Northern California and in Washington, particularly a few decades ago, there was a really robust forest defense movement in this region, in this ecosystem or biosphere. And as Vetch mentioned, there's a variety of tactics that were employed, such as treesits, which is a very useful way to occupy an area and to make it really difficult to be removed safely. Another tactic that was used is road blockades, which are specifically good for keeping something in or out, like a logging truck. There were many other tactics used. Some that had a really, really high degree of risk, physical risk, as well as risk of arrest and risk of state repression. Yeah, there was a variety of specific timber sales and locations where forest defense was centered around. Some really famous places were like Warner Creek and Eagle Creek, which is closer to us in so-called Portland. Some of these places, there were active occupations going for many years. Some would last only months, but some of these occupations of the forest lasted for several years and really morphed in the different tactics and strategies that they used, with the ultimate goal being of getting those specific timber sales to be dropped. I want to highlight an individual, Judy Berry, who was an activist and organizer, very active and very outspoken, and someone who really saw connections between forest defense and workers' rights and an anti-globalization trend. Just to again underscore the importance of solidarity with other movements and continually seeing the connections that exist between forest work and climate work, as well as social justice and movements that are happening all over the world. Judy Berry is someone who was targeted in a car bombing, which eventually led to her death. So I just wanted to uplift this individual as being a really great example of what the movement was like back in the 90s, and of a leader who was both really staunchly nonviolent and seeing solidarity connections, and also someone who was targeted through violence. There also is the history of the Green Scare and the political repression and a lot of infighting and sabotage and all sorts of ways that the FBI took down this movement. And that's part of the reason why we have been spending a lot of time really thinking about what our communication processes are and building trust and building a culture of security. That's something that is discussed very frequently in organizing and in direct action movements, is building security culture. And that means having a really heightened awareness of what surveillance might be happening to our groups, what sort of infiltration might be happening in our groups. And it means at the same time having an openness to bringing new people into the movement and to having a base of trust. But also just being really careful and mindful about how we're discussing specific topics, how our identities are used or protected. And in this digital age, the technical security concerns are a whole other aspect. I mean, we're having this conversation on Zoom right now, so super meta security culture discussion here. But it is really important, and that's one of the many lessons that I think that we can take from the history of forest defense in this region. Another really important lesson, I think, is in making sure that all voices are heard, and that we have a focus on inclusivity and really listening to people who are having issues or are not having their needs met within the movement. Yeah, so that's just a little bit about some of the history in the Pacific Northwest. And I wanted to talk about, wow, the time is just so flying. I wanted to talk about points of intervention. These are 5 areas in which you can think about being able to apply influence. And this applies to direct action, and it also applies to a lot of the work that nonprofits are able to do. Because I know that nonprofits can't always engage in nonviolent direct action in the same way that an autonomous group like us maybe can. So these 5 points of intervention are assumption, decision, destruction, production, and consumption. So we'll break this down a little bit. Assumption is a point of intervention. And this is where kind of the ideological battle is waged. Where right now there's the assumption that logging can reduce fire risk. And that is a point of intervention where we can see that that is a fallacy that we can address. The point of intervention of decision. This is like, who has the power to make the decisions? Perhaps that's the Forest Service, or perhaps that's with the courts. And that's a place where a lot of legal groups and nonprofits can work to apply pressure to the decision makers. Or that's a place where a direct action could be placing an influence. Another point of intervention is destruction. That is the place where the logging is happening or the roads are being built. And this is a place where some of the more physical and dramatic acts of direct action might occur. Historically, people have gone so far as to chain their necks to a truck so that it would not drive down the road. Sorry, I'm trying to rush because we're almost at 1. The 2 last points of intervention: production. That could be like the mills or the shipyards, and the point of consumption. And that could be a place that creates or sells wood products. So these are just, and the examples I used apply to forest defense, but you could think about these 5 points of intervention in any sort of direct action context that you might be in, or whatever your target is. You can think about, what are the assumptions? How can that be a target space? Who is the decision maker? What is the point of destruction? What is the point of production? And what is the point of consumption? Yes, with our limited time, I think I should just stop there and see if there are any final questions or thoughts, and I think we'll have to wrap up.